The late 90s into the early 2000s, a time that most considered the golden age of survival horror video games. Credit to Capcom at this point for creating some of the more tentpole titles of the genre. The Dino Crisis series was carrying strong, as well as the Resident Evil entries that were coming seemingly almost every year. However, there was a new IP on the horizon for Capcom, this one introducing new game mechanics as well as addressing complaints from prior games that were in a similar vein like Clock Tower 3. So today that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at Haunting Ground and find out if it deserves a place amongst Capcom's legacy titles, or if it's just another game lost in the shuffle of the constant obscure releases for the 6th generation of consoles. I'm Zachariah Kaine, this is Kaine Enabled. Let's take a look.
Haunting Ground was published and released in 2005 by Capcom exclusively for Sony's PlayStation 2. Given the running title Demento in Japan, Capcom began development of the game in 2004. Knowing the direction they wanted to take with the game, planning on it initially focusing on one female character, much like the most recent entry in another franchise they had completed working on years prior, Clock Tower 3. However, fairly early on in the development cycle, they decided instead of hoping for players and critics alike to both be ready for another helpless schoolgirl horror story, they would instead opt to adding a companion to join this main character alongside of her during her journey. You control 18-year-old Fiona Belli, accompanied by her canine companion Hewie. The journey of the game sees the two exploring a vast estate consisting of a castle, mansion, forest, and more, all while being hunted down by a collection of the compound's inhabitants, all with their own motives. Finding an escape becomes more difficult as each passageway forward seemingly leads the two deeper into a root of Fiona's true purpose on the property. Entangling her in a web of loss, greed, and betrayal, Fiona must conquer these fears and face the haunting truth as well as any obstacles placed ahead of her if she hopes to make it out of these grounds alive. Starting things off with the tone, Haunting Ground captures it beautifully. The castle where Fiona spends most of her time traveling has medieval architecture, and that theme trickles down all the way from the attire of its inhabitants to the decor of every room in the castle. The game is set in what has to be assumed current time, or at least current as of 2005, considering the opening cutscene shows Fiona with her parents driving a fairly modern looking vehicle. So, to hard cut from living in a college dorm room to waking up in a decrepit, candlelit dungeon on the grounds of a cobweb-infested Victorian-era castle definitely helps drive home the sense of being out of place so well. It's also taking place in what feels like middle to late fall, from the trees appearing to have lost most, if not all, of their leaves and fields of grass long since dead covering the canvas of these courtyards, to the overcast skies that seem to indicate a storm is always just on the horizon, which again helped to set the tone of this game's dark and often controversial subject matter so well.
On top of all this, the development team also did something else very unique for the time. Instead of using an exterior soundtrack and importing it into the game, placing it into specific spots of the game, they actually used built-in sounds from within the PS2 to create the soundtrack. Making some of the most eerie atmospheric tones I've heard in games in a while, honestly. They use ambient drones instead of long orchestral pieces to kind of draw out the eeriness.
Control-wise, Haunting Ground behaves like a typical survival horror game of its time. Think Resident Evil Code Veronica X, with those fixed camera angles and that occasional drifting or panning shot that allow you to see these beautifully fully sculpted 3D environments, all the way down to the way you control Fiona herself, mirroring that of Claire and Chris Redfield. Now, the foundation of the game, from a mechanic and control aspect, is split between two different modes. You get a panic mode, which is very similar to the panic system within Clock Tower 3, as well as a companion mechanic that allows bonding and commands with your canine counterpart. Going in depth with both, first let's take a look at the panic mode. Various encounters and interactions throughout the game contributes to raising Fiona's mental state, whether it be her fear of small things like insects or reacting to a door in the same room that you're currently in slamming shut on its own. Fiona's heart rate slowly begins to accelerate with each unexpected event, causing the screen to slightly distort with each beat. But unlike Clock Tower 3, there isn't an actual meter on screen that lets you know just how much more you can take before plummeting into mass panic. And once this happens, it's an entirely different game. Fiona is in this constant state of running forward. You're only able to actually control her direction of movement, but anything and everything become an obstacle at this point. And to top it off, the visuals themselves become more and more distorted as the panic level raises. First, adding a slight motion blur to most of the environment, making memory of the specific room you're in your best friend. And finally, at its maximum level, everything turns black and white with no discernible idea of anything around you other than masses of darkness, and coming into contact with too many of these walls or other aforementioned objects strewn about will put Fiona into full panic. Your controller vibrates violently, and Fiona just simply collapses to the ground, awaiting her killing blow to be delivered, which in full panic mode is absolutely what's going to happen. However, this is when, if you've taken any time in the game up to this point to develop your bond, that second focal point becomes key. See, the companion command is introduced early on in the game, which allows you to both praise and scold Hewie for both obeying or ignoring your requests, telling him to stay, explore ahead, or stick to your side as you discover untraveled areas, as well as issuing him to attack any pursuer as long as they get close enough to you, allowing you to recover or get a head start on running away. And in the final moments of full panic, let me tell you, having that built up good enough bond with Hewie can be the only thing separating you from life and death. Issuing him to attack with stronger bond will have Hewie respond almost instantaneously, as opposed to if you were only to use him during key events, he may take 2-3 commands before he actually listens to you. So feeding him treats and praising him throughout the game is key when it comes to bonding with him. In fact, it's so important that the best ending in the game is actually tied to having a certain level of bond with Hewie. And at times, sure, this can be a bit frustrating, but that's kind of the point. Bonding with Hewie is supposed to be a slow build, but before you know it, given the proper reaction to every choice, your bond will be solidified, his loyalty will be yours, and you'll have your most powerful line of defense at its maximum potential.
But that doesn't mean that my experience with the game was gumdrops and roses either, and that's kind of the point again. There were times when I would issue a command and he would sit there. I'd issue it again and he'd bark at me. And the third time he would kind of just lay down, and I think this is when you're supposed to scold him. I read where you're supposed to at least give it 2 tries before actually reprimanding him. But there were even times when I would give it 3-4 times and he would still lay there. Or if I would issue a command, tell him to go somewhere, he would disobey. And then when I would tell him to come back, as I was issuing the command, he would start to go forward. So I didn't know if the mechanic was flawed just a little bit, or if they're just trying to legitimately go into the fact that this is a 4-year-old dog who's just meeting you for the first time, so why would he listen to you? I get it, but at the same time, it's kind of like, eh. And another thing, there's this optional area very early on into the game, actually right after you get Hewie, where you can issue him to go through a hole in the side of a stone wall, and then he'll push a crate out of the way of a blocked door. Pushing this door open will allow you to go to a new area of the game, and this seems like a training dog area. It's got ramps and attack dummies, and there's a ball you can even throw across the yard and have him go get. I have no real idea if this had any actual effect, but I spent a good 15 minutes in that area just trying to solidify our bond and tell him what to do, command, and then praise him for listening to me. Again, I don't know if this actually works, but it's something I absolutely did. Next, we'll talk about gameplay, but first I wanted to touch base on something that I find so impressive with the game that games to this day still struggle with: the loading times. This game literally does the most seamless transition from room to room. There's no loading at all. The only time I ever saw the loading screen was when I was actually loading up my save at the start or stop of a new session. Other than that, when you go to a cutscene, you know it's going to be a cutscene because the screen will fade to black. Literally, there are no stops or anything in this game. It's seriously so impressive.
And on top of the atmosphere itself, the game doesn't have mobs of enemies to deal with, which is actually a nice touch. The game is separated more or less by a chapter system. Each of the pursuers that chase you throughout the game mark the beginning or end of a specific chapter. Of course, there are subsections and additions to go along with each of these, but as soon as you dispatch of a specific pursuer, you pretty much know that that chapter is over, and the game all but confirms this by not allowing you to return to that specific area of the game, marking the beginning of the next section. And outside of your pursuers, the only real threats to deal with in this game are these little glowing orbs called luminescents, as well as these little Silent Hill children mini-me's called failures. Both enemy types are few and far between, and their purpose is really only to raise panic level in Fiona, alerting her pursuer of where she's at, and making the game just a little more difficult.
Plus death traps. No survival horror game is complete without its share. Stepping in the wrong spot or making the wrong decision, instantly activating a death scene. And let me be honest with you, I died more times from death traps than from actual pursuers or enemies in the game.
When it comes to combat, Haunting Ground keeps things simple. They chose not to allow Fiona the ability to carry an arsenal, as well as not having Chun-Li quality kicks. Although I do admit I enjoyed punting a few of those failures around. She's a timid 18-year-old college student, so her attack strategy should reflect this. Fiona is only equipped with a weak shin kick and the ability to shove an enemy back after taking a running start. Other than that, if somehow you're able to master the crafting ability in this game, you can create objects that you set on the ground and are detonated by a pursuer when they step on them, and there's another craftable that can be thrown at the enemy, pausing them and damaging them for several seconds. But other than that, Fiona has no offensive whatsoever.
And I felt this was both good and bad at times. There would be moments where I was just about to complete a task, finish the last steps of a specific sequence to progress the story, all to get to the very end of it and be told I don't have time for this right now because one of them decided to pop up into the room. So I'd have to stop everything I was doing, go find a hiding spot, or the very few and far between environmental hazards that this game has. If you activate one of them, it does get rid of the pursuer for quite a bit of time, but like I said, I only ended up finding I think 3 out of the entire playthrough. And I get why they did it, it helps to build the suspense. I was just more used to the Clock Tower 3 approach. When an enemy would come in the room, you can still carry on about your business. He busts down the door, hey, don't even worry about it. Go ahead and flick that switch and keep it moving. It hurts and it helps at the same time. Like I said, I understand why it's been done. It halts the story and gives a sense of fear, panic, and seriousness to this pursuer instead of just kind of not taking him seriously and continuing from A to Z. I do understand, but at the same time, it was kind of annoying more than it was scary.
And another thing I feel is required for survival horror games of the generation was good puzzle solving. And boy, let me tell you, Haunting Ground has its fair share. I'm serious, I counted almost 20 puzzles within the first several hours of this game, using puzzle solving skills to figure out what to do in the next step to progress the story. Some are super rewarding and others can feel really frustrating, but for all the wrong reasons.
So late into the game, there's this puzzle where you have to step on a stone and it activates the next stone. But taking your foot off of this stone deactivates that stone. So obviously you have to step on a stone, issue Hewie to go to the next stone, tell him to sit, run to the next stone after that. But way more often than not, as I was running to that next stone, for whatever reason, Hewie broke off the path and decided to come sit by me. This killed the game for me. I mean, this was so late into the game that I felt like our bond was solidified. He was attacking on command, he was listening to everything I said, but for whatever reason, anytime I would tell him to sit, he wouldn't respond. He would just come right over to me. I would get literally right at the end of it, and he'd come off of it and have to do the entire thing over again. Gathering key items is a way to advance the plot in this game and uncover the twisted reasoning behind Fiona's presence in the castle. So I guess since we've got this far, let's go ahead and dive into the plot.
The game's opening trailer plays out like a dream sequence, showing a young girl wrapped in a thin white sheet, walking aimlessly forward down a red-lit hallway. Eerie bells chime in and make an unsettling melody. The hallway is lined with bodies, ethereal clouds, and pillars, seemingly guiding her in the only direction of travel, forward. There are cuts that show streams of blood cascading down prone bodies, and then the action kicks in as a new scene shows an ogreishly sized hand rubbing that same girl's stomach, with flashes of imagery including car crashes, hatchets, and ending with what would have to be assumed that same behemoth with the oversized mitt from the last scene, chasing that same terrified girl through a dark hallway, with only periodic flashes of lightning outside of the castle windows acting as a guide through her darkness. She collapses to the floor, turns back, sees the same hand reaching for her, lets out a blood-curdling scream. The scene ends, the title fades in, and the mood's been set. This is Haunting Ground.
And talk about a mood setter. I had no idea what to expect in this game, so watching that opening scene, this really got me pumped up and excited for what was next to come. I thought this game was going to be more like Clock Tower 3 since people often compared it to Clock Tower 3, but it already felt leaps and bounds beyond.
And so the story finally begins, with the same giant from the opening sequence cooking now. He stops what he's doing and walks over to where we see our protagonist, the girl walking the blood-tinted hallway of that dream sequence, locked up in a cage on the ground. This is Fiona Belli, an 18-year-old college student who, while at home visiting her parents, is involved in a freak car accident. Fiona awakens in a dimly lit dungeon inside of an iron cage, with no recollection of how she ended up where she is or the whereabouts of her parents, who were also in the car at the time of the accident. Fiona realizes that the lock of the cage she's in isn't even latched, so, after easily escaping the cage, she's startled by a dog seemingly plotting a similar escape, flying from off the screen and rushing to a staircase seemingly leading outside. Picking up the animal's collar that it had just dropped, she notices the name Hewie etched on the nameplate. Heading to the same stairwell hoping for escape, unfortunately, with each step she ascends, she moves closer towards the descent into her own nightmare, with each clue of the mystery getting clearer while also getting even darker.
Now, I know that line was corny, but trust me, once we get into the spoiler section of this, you'll understand exactly why the game caught so much critical flack. You don't have to worry about too much gore or violence, but if tones of rape upset you, you have my blessing to bail now. And for anybody who wants to avoid spoilers of any kind, go ahead and skip ahead to this point, and for anybody else, let's take on.
And so, after exiting the dungeon and finding the only entry point into the castle leading to the master bedroom, we utilize a fresh set of clothes provided to us. Considering to this point we're only fitted with a bed sheet, this probably isn't the worst idea. Afterwards, finishing up our first encounter in the castle, having a one-sided conversation with a maid who seems more invested in a painting on the wall behind you rather than acknowledging Fiona's pleas for escape.
Yes, Master. We will keep her here for a while. I will make sure she stays comfortable.
After a bit of exploring, we meet Debilitus, a giant of a man with an apparent mental disability who sees Fiona as just another one of his dolls, simply wishing to play. And so, a chase with Fiona begins, carrying on throughout the castle. After this game's hiding mechanic is introduced, which is very similar to the Clock Tower 3 mechanic, minus those suspense-ruining, glowing hide here orbs that game decided to include for whatever reason, we lose Debilitus for the moment. Next, entering a room, we're greeted with the melodies of a grand piano. Afterwards, we hear a voice over top of us calling out,
"Ah, Fiona! I see you finally awakened. You will be mine, Fiona."
After being instructed to remove the sheet from what looks to be wood-carved version of Fiona bearing child, we grab a key from a coffee table in front of the emotionless statuette and exit hastily. Next, using the key on a locked door, and then closing the same door behind us, cutting off the luminescence trail, takes Fiona into the castle's kitchen. From here we do more exploring, all while taking part in Debilitus' mindless game of hide-and-seek. But this is cut short as a voice is heard, which halts the behemoth in his tracks and actually sends him away. Afterwards, the face attached to the voice appears and introduces himself as Ricardo, then going on to tell Fiona that both of her parents were actually killed in the car accident from before, making her the heir to the Belli Castle, the very castle she's been imprisoned in, causing Fiona to understandably faint. Waking up in the castle and combating denial, the nightmare continues. Afterward, freeing a dog that's been chained to the tree just outside of where she awoke, Fiona is greeted again by Debilitus, knocking her to the ground, but thankfully, her recently rescued canine friend arrives to assist Fiona, attacking the ogre and sending him fleeing. Making the connection that this is the Hewie from the name tag, he is reunited with his collar as Fiona praises him, and Hewie continues the rest of this mad journey by his new master's side. Re-entering the kitchen this time to find the maid, now known as Daniela, making dinner, we're stopped next by a ringing phone which we decide to answer, hearing yet another unsettling voice from the other side of the phone telling us to both
be wary of Ricardo,
and then going on to mention something about
your asshole.
And things only get stranger from here as the next cutscene shows Fiona stumbling upon Ricardo and Daniela.
The Azoth is mine.
Initially when I saw this part, I was a little confused. I misread the maid's silence as her protecting Fiona. But as soon as I saw that maniacal smirk as she stared daggers through that keyhole, I knew her intentions were comprised of an entirely different evil.
Later, we receive a note from a man named Lorenzo. Inside the note, he tells us that Ricardo has sealed the front gates of the castle, preventing any means of escape, but then going on to provide alternate routes to get out of this nightmare. So after finding ourselves in the chapel of the building, we grab the goddess key and head back to the exit, only to be greeted once more by Debilitus, locking the door behind him as we prepare to end this nuisance once and for all. After a short and simple battle, seeing a chandelier fall on the head of Debilitus, we comfort Hewie and let out a sigh of relief, only to see Debilitus again rising from the shattered glass, this time simply bowing before Fiona, as almost asking for forgiveness, and then leaving her alone for good, ending his chapter of the game.
Just a little side note here, this isn't necessary for the completion of the game, it's just a nice little bonus. If you go back to Debilitus' hut after you defeat him, he'll again apologize to you and give you a smudged key. You take this smudged key to the restroom and you use it on one of the stalls. You're then granted access to an underground area that's housing a pair of metal boots that actually gives you a nice bonus to your kick stats. Again, not necessary, but it's very nice for this to be included into the game. It just gives me those tones again of explore everything and find more than you actually need.
After attempting to use the newly acquired goddess key, we're stopped by the maid once again, this time insisting that we return to the dining hall for dinner.
Dinner is served, miss.
As you proceed to ingest your dinner, the maid, Daniela, reveals that she is not real, simply a creation of her master, perfect in every way, except for the fact that she cannot reproduce, as well as lacking the ability to feel emotion, pleasure, or taste. As Fiona leaves the dining hall,
I'm not complete.
barely making it to her bed before collapsing, coming down from what looks to be food poisoning. Fiona is awakened in the same bed she collapsed in prior, with Daniela obsessively touching her. Then, walking to the large bedroom window, she once again says the phrase,
I am not complete.
before repetitively slamming her head into the glass, shattering it with several blows. Next, depression turns into mad envy as she removes a large sliver of the broken glass from the window and turns back, this time putting her focus solely on Fiona. Carrying on and using the Saturnus key, we enter a new corridor where we once again see Daniela approaching, makeshift glass machete in hand, and same menacing look on her face. She's stopped in her track by a reflection in a mirror, as staring at herself seems to send her into a fit of insanity, almost breaking her brain entirely as she stands here twitching and convulsing uncontrollably. Feeling it's not best to worry about her, Fiona continues onward.
Then after we get the Jupiter key, we enter one of two rooms on either side of a giant mural. This puzzle is one of my favorite ones in the game, actually. There are two different rooms. They look identical, but there are small differences in both of the rooms, and the only clue you have is a note right at the beginning of the entrance. At first, I just guessed and got the answer correct, but right after that, I learned the error of my ways, getting mauled to death by hundreds of flying bugs.
Then, after solving a puzzle and a pretty admittedly solid jump scare, we enter a crypt thanks to Hewie's keen sense of smell. Then afterwards we view a film that shows several key moments from the game up to this point, but from a perspective that is yet to be seen. One of which showing Debilitus carrying Fiona's unconscious body back to the dungeon, another of Fiona getting dressed at the bedside, retrieving the goddess key in the chapel, another from moments just prior passing a wood-carved woman sitting on a bench in just another pass-through hallway, but seemingly coming from that wood-carved woman's perspective this time. And finally, Ricardo and Daniela having a conversation before Ricardo arranging 3 cubes in a specific way to unlock a door ahead of you proceeds.
Now, the film itself I actually enjoyed a lot, showing moments where you felt safest actually being moments that you were actually exposed more than others, as well as going into explaining how you ended up in the dungeon from the first place being carried by Debilitus. I will say that the one part that I didn't care much about in the film was how they hard zoomed in onto the puzzle solution after Ricardo aligned those cubes. Me being who I am, and I'm sure many other people did as well, as soon as we saw it from a distance, we kind of either made a mental note or we wrote it down, just because that's kind of what you've always done with survival horror games at the time. So for them to go all the way in and go, here, do you see this right here? This is the answer. Are you paying attention? That kind of just took away from the effect for me.
Next, Daniela finally reveals her intentions. The Azoth that Fiona has within her is essentially the essence of life, and Daniela, fueled by jealousy, is now set on either obtaining it for herself or simply to kill Fiona out of envy. But before she has that chance, Daniela is dispatched. Activating a backlit floor mirror, Daniela sees herself once again in its reflection, driving her mad as the sky dome above her shatters, resulting in a shower of glass falling down around her with the grand finale, a giant splintered shard impaling Daniela and ending her life as she cryptically lets out one final emotionless smile.
And so to this point, we've taken out 2 of the pursuers in the game, but if I'm being honest, their reasonings aren't that bad, I guess. First, Debilitus. He's the groundskeeper of the facility, and it just seems like he wants a playmate. He doesn't want to actually hurt Fiona. And now, granted, his lack of mental capacity makes him a danger to anybody around him, and eventually he will hurt somebody, but it's not like he has malicious intent whatsoever. Then secondly, Daniela the maid, her reasoning for one of the Azoth is something more complex, I guess. So she wants to feel complete in her master's eyes, her master making her and telling her that she is the perfect woman, but lacking the ability to reproduce, as well as lacking the ability to have taste or experience pleasure and emotion. So to me, I feel as she wanted to obtain the Azoth, and the reasoning behind it is, at that point, hopefully in her master's eyes, she will actually be equal to a human in this world, feeling more complete, more accepted by her master. I don't know, I just felt like the 2 biggest threats in this game so far actually have a justifiable reason. But don't worry, from this point things are only going to go downhill.
Next, in an area housing what appears to be scientific rejects and childlike creatures called failures, Ricardo appears, taking aim with his flintlock pistol after becoming angry at Fiona's constant refusal to accept her place as heir to the castle. Running away and getting an item that unlocks the front door, we escape the mansion, entering the Chaos Forest. Entering the Chaos Forest, we see Hewie run off instantly, losing our companion for the entirety of this section.
Now, the Chaos Forest itself doesn't actually house enemies or threats for that matter. It's just a long, winding, confusing maze. Opening up the map shows treetops, so you aren't actually able to figure out which turn you need to make. So it can take a little longer than normal to get through this section, but it still wasn't horrible.
After exploring the forest thoroughly, we approach the edge of a cliff where we're confronted by Ricardo. He tells Fiona the reasoning for all this is because she inherited her father's Azoth, after that informing us that he is actually a clone of the great alchemist Retrospective Belli. He then tells Fiona that the Azoth is the essence of life from which all formulas can be created, including immortality. And if that wasn't weird enough, he then goes on to reveal that Ugo, Fiona's father, was a clone of the exact same man, eliminating any doubt when he removes his hood, having the exact same face as Ugo. We then cut to another flashback of the car accident, this time showing that Ricardo was actually the cause of the crash, ramming his vehicle into the Belli families before sending them head-on into a tree, killing her mother on impact before unsheathing a dagger and plunging it into the chest of Ugo, with a smirk on his face, watching the life drain from Ugo's eyes. Fiona, handling as much as she could, faints and collapses to the ground.
You are about to give birth to me all over again.
Okay, so at this point, I'm becoming more and more confused as to exactly what the Azoth is. First, the maid. She just wanted it for her ability to create life, I felt, or at least, like I said, to appear equal in her master's eyes. Then Ricardo comes along and tells you that he needs it to make a potion. I didn't know if it was something in her blood, if it was something intangible like her spirit. I legitimately had no idea what the Azoth was. So I basically accepted the fact that it's just something that Fiona has that everybody else wants, and then I just kept it moving.
Waking up again in a cell, Fiona's been stripped of her usual attire, now only wearing a makeshift operation gown. Ordering Hewie to grab a key to our cell, which is conveniently on the table next to Fiona, within the cell itself we also find a note from our mysterious pen pal Lorenzo, this time seemingly aware of our capture inside of what he's calling the water tower, along with a detailed route of how to escape. Exiting the cell, Hewie is alerted by something just in front of us. Then, manifesting before our eyes, Ricardo appears. First, yelling at Hewie for discovering him, then arrogantly boasting as he informs us that he has taken a formula that makes him appear invisible to the eye. So, the next section of chase sequences will definitely be the toughest yet.
This was a bit of a miss for me. I understand Ricardo is a clone of a great alchemist, so invisibility and potions shouldn't be unreasonable. But I feel like it was so late into the game, and all of a sudden, it just feels like, hey, out of nowhere, I'm going to be invisible now. I do got to admit, at this point, though, his encounters become more stressful. At first, he's got that flintlock pistol, which, if he does hit you, you basically fall to the ground and accept death. But when he's invisible, you'd have no idea where he's at. He'll fade in and out every now and again, but for the most part, I found the most stressful area of the game, for me, this area. Running up that spire, having not saved yet, colliding with Luminescence and dealing with him at the same time, I legitimately thought I was going to die at least 3 or 4 times in just one journey to the top.
After finding a miniature figurine of a bridge, we set off to the top of the tower, dodging invisible Ricardo and luminescence galore along the way up a pretty lengthy section.
So like I said before, now that he's invisible, it adds stress to his encounters. I remember at this point of the game, I hadn't saved it for at least an hour, so evading luminescence and then finding him popping up in front of me, sending me into that almost full panic mode, had me right on the edge several times. And to be honest, there are things you can craft in this game with the crafting system to calm down your levels of panic and restore your stamina, but for whatever reason, I could not get the crafting system down at all. I just found myself button mashing the craftables and just coming up with random ones when I wouldn't even try, as opposed to when I would actually try, ending up with all grays, resulting in nothing. So I had to rely on my pup at this point. Come on, Hewie, don't let me down.
Finally, on top of the water tower, we trigger a bridge to rise from the water outside of the tower, giving us our means of escape. But before we can leave the rooftop, Ricardo manifests again, inflicting enough damage to slow Ricardo, then ordering Hewie into one of several crawl spaces along the spire, which leads to higher vantage points. Hewie then leaps from above, colliding with the mad scientist, sending him stumbling off of an area of the roof that had no railing, free-falling before abruptly ending his descent as he lands on our newly erected bridge, killing him instantly. Crossing the bridge and entering the newly accessible mansion, we find an elderly man who seems to sympathize with Fiona over the torture and stress Ricardo has just put her through up to this point. Next, revealing that he is the actual Areolas Lorenzo Belli, the man from which Ugo and Ricardo were both cloned. He then goes on to express his dislike for Ayla, Fiona's mother, for stealing Ugo from him, feeling like Ugo betrayed him by escaping his castle and running away to start his own life with his wife Ayla and their baby Fiona. Lorenzo then expresses the Azoth belongs to him and that obtaining it will allow his rebirth and immortality.
And this is the point of the game where they double down on that implication of incest and rape. This man is essentially a roundabout Fiona's grandfather, or at the very least, he possesses the exact genetic structure of the man who created her, Ugo. So maybe like a prototype father. Yet he doesn't want to rape her, but he still wants to impregnate her with his own seed. He wants her to give birth to him, which will then make him immortal. This part is insane, and it amplifies just how messed up these people are and the screwed up things that they'll go through just to obtain her Azoth.
After luring Lorenzo onto an oversized conveyor belt, we watch as he is horrifically crushed by a giant roller. Then, entering an unescapable hallway, we hear that same man's voice telling us he can die and that we are now trapped.
Oh, how I love thee, Azoth!
Then, after allowing Fiona passage, he claims his need for the Azoth once again, much like Ricardo, needing it for the essence of life, converting it into power, making life eternal. He then transforms from an elderly man to a young, fit version of himself. Escaping from here, we end up in a circular room with a giant pit of lava at its center. To one side, we find a shrine, which Hewie picks up the scent of something recently removed. Then, after following the scent, we end up locating the actual Kaine of Caduceus. Returning to the lava pit room and placing the cane into a slot on the shrine triggers the apparent start of what seems to be a self-destruction of the entire area. But before we can escape the room, Lorenzo arrives and the last boss encounter begins.
So the actual final battle is really simple. You run around the pit and you activate these switches blowing steam out of these ventilation fans. It seemed honestly like the easiest encounter to me, but when I started to do follow-up research on the internet, apparently everybody has this as panned as one of the most ridiculous boss battles in the game, if not that generation. I literally had no clue that he had a one-shot hit because I was just avoiding him. I don't know if I got lucky or if it was just skill. It's not bragging, it's just the kind of thought it was funny that people were so frustrated over this boss and I literally didn't take damage from him. I just kept it moving to the next area like, wow, he was kind of easy.
After watching Lorenzo fall into the pit of lava, it's time to escape once and for all. But as we escape, we're once again pursued, this time for the last time, by the flaming remains of Lorenzo, as he screams Fiona's name in both agony and obsession. Fiona! Escaping the mines, we get to where we found the Kaine of Caduceus, only for one of the two angel statues that were harmlessly on display moments prior crash down onto us.
At this point, all I'm going to say is if you've ever played Metal Gear Solid, I hope you never submitted to the torture chamber.
A button mash frenzy ensues as we move the statue inch by inch off of us back to its original position, all the while the camera is angled in just a way where the added pressure of watching the glow of Lorenzo's flaming body illuminate the tunnel behind us to the point where he's inches from Fiona before returning the angel to its resting position. A finger's reach from sending Fiona into death's clutches. From here, it's back to the main hall. Rushing towards the now illuminating Merle-etched door, we're cut off by Lorenzo, but he collapses and crumbles to a pile of ashes and bones. Finally defeated. We then exit the door, and the nightmare is finally over.
The next cutscene we see is actually the ending cutscene. There are 4 in this game. In my first playthrough, I got the A one, which is very similar to the B one. You see Fiona walking to the gate, shaking uncontrollably. Hewie being there beside her kind of comforts her, allows her to unlock the gate and exit. The difference between the A scenario and the B scenario, however, is Hewie turns back to the front of the castle, and next thing you notice, Debilitus walks out of the front doors holding a giant pair of scissors. Again, I thought this was a very nice touch and a nice nod to the Clock Tower series, and it almost makes Fiona feel like things may get bad again. However, Debilitus stares at Fiona and pretty much allows her exit. He kind of nods at her and just says, "You've done well," and kind of releases her. Again, like I said, this was a nice touch. It was a nice nod to the Clock Tower series, and it felt good. Getting the A scenario just requires you to have a solid bond with Hewie, as well as disposing of Debilitus a specific way. Like I said, the B ending is similar to the A ending except for the giant scissors cutscene. The C ending is only obtained through a second playthrough, going back through the game a second time, defeating Debilitus, going back to his hut. He gives you that smudged key that I had mentioned before. Going back down into that stairwell, this time you obtain the key to the front of the castle, and you literally walk out the front door an hour into the game. And the funniest part about that is Lorenzo.
Don't go, Fiona. My life, my Azov, Fiona.
On top of these 3 endings, there's one more ending, the bad ending. Having a low level of bond with Hewie, he won't rescue you from Ricardo, allowing Ricardo to capture Fiona and the game to just end. And so the relief I felt after playing this game felt really earned. I enjoyed every bit of this game that I could. It took me 9 hours or so to appreciate the game. That was going down every hallway, trying to figure out every little secret in the game. The excitement of fear, something I hadn't felt in ages. I definitely enjoyed it. Something that's been few and far between with games as of late, but every time I get the chance to experience something like this, it takes me back and I love it. At the time of its release, this game was vilified. It wasn't looked at as just another survival horror game. It was looked at as a game that capitalizes on the objectification and sexualization of women, being sought after and treated as items of possession. I will say that may be true, but to think that this game was obliterated for its choice of storytelling, it just feels wrong. Now, maybe at that time, that was kind of an unacceptable line to cross, but thinking about the day and age we live in now, where video games are finally getting that respect and being treated as forms of art with storytelling, I feel like Haunting Ground honestly needs to be re-experienced.
The game has also been commonly associated with the Clock Tower series, both being called a direct spin-off, which has never been officially confirmed by anyone in Capcom, as well as being a spiritual successor to the franchise. And the game certainly does enough to back up these comparisons. For one, I mentioned back in the spoiler section, which we won't get into here, but there's another nod to the franchise that's not spoilery at all. In the game, there are these items called weeping stones, where, when placed on the ground, then stepped on by the pursuer, emits a loud noise that distracts him. Now in Clock Tower 3, there are these optional lost spirits you can choose to help peacefully pass on by completing various tasks associated with that spirit's death, sometimes placing an engagement ring on the corpse of a deceased, or reuniting a fountain pen with its leather-bound counterpart. However, getting too close to these spirits before satisfying their wishes leads them to lashing out and attacking Alyssa. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it?
I remember when I first heard the sound of the game, I was in a boss battle and I had to almost pause the game because it just shattered my brain. I'm like, holy cow, like what a great tip of the cap. It made sense to me now why they keep comparing this game to the Clock Tower series and saying it's a spin-off. And then again, I could be reading into it because Capcom reusing old assets, that's the tale as old as time. I mean, for the same fact of the matter, the page-turning sound effect is the one from Resident Evil in the game. But nevertheless, my choice was to believe that this was just a subtle bow to this predecessor and not just reusing old effects.
Post-game replay value is decent with the addition of a hard mode as well as a secret room which acts as a media hub, allowing you to view all of the cutscenes, concept art, music gallery, costume changes, as well as a mini-game where you play as Hewie guiding Fiona through various stages, avoiding hazards and attackers along the way. This mode wasn't my cup of tea, then again I'm not a fan of escort missions, but if this fits your fancy, have fun. To sum this game up, Haunting Ground managed to recapture an emotion that I haven't experienced from video games in years, anxiously opening the door to an untraveled area, hoping to hear that familiar tick-tock of that grandfather clock letting me know that Sanctuary is just ahead, or crouching in a corner and feeling a chill run down my spine as footsteps echo nearby, faintly at first, growing heavier and heavier. Taking that split second to decide if I should run into another room and shut the door behind me, risking exposure, or trust that I'm in just a good enough spot to avoid detection. That moment of anticipation is one of the most important aspects of survival horror, and one that I feel the genre has strayed away from for the sake of cheap cutaway jump scares, and honestly I miss it. The popularity of Haunting Ground hasn't faded either. It's actually risen from a 6 out of 10 obscure survival horror title to crossovers including 2016's Street Fighter V seeing Kaine have a Fiona-based alternate costume. Also, Fiona is a collectible card in 2007's SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters DS. And to top it off, Fiona, Hewie, and Abilitas all appear in a specific character's ending cutscene in 2010's Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Ultimate All-Stars. Whether its spike in popularity is due to being a true gem with content that was just too ahead of its time finally getting its just desserts, or just a result of low print rate and high demand, Haunting Ground definitely breathes rarefied air that I'd recommend to any survival horror enthusiast.
So at the end of the day, do I recommend Haunting Ground? Absolutely. The big problem with that is that this game fetches a high price right now. Copies of this game complete go for $300 and up. That's kind of a habit that we're seeing, and it's really trendy in video games right now. Games that were more sought after or rarer of that 6th console generation are shooting up in price. It's kind of unfortunate for genuine consumers like us because being driven to piracy isn't something that's necessarily frowned upon, but at the same time, it's not something that we actively want to promote. But when a game like this comes along once in a lifetime, I feel like people need to experience it. So to be told that the only way you're going to be able to get this game is to pay $300, $400 for it is a really hard ask. In all fairness though, it was released on the Japanese PlayStation Store, so if you can obtain a Japanese region PlayStation 3, go for it. And on top of that, the Power Region copies of this game are still a viable option, but they still also fetch a decently high price. So I guess at the end of the day, if you're able to actually find a way to get this game and play it, it'll be worth its time. But if you're not, and you can't justify spending any sort of money, that's why I made this. It's a review where I touch base on a lot of plot points and a lot of just exploration in itself to get people to feel like they're experiencing the game without having to experience the cost along with it.